Growing up in the hollers wasn't about fancy raised beds or drip irrigation kits. If you'd walked into your hillbilly grandma's barn, you wouldn't have found grow lights or soil testers. You'd have found mason jars, feed sacks, coffee cans, and a coon dog snoring in the corner. Back then, folks didn't have money for chemical fertilizer or store-bought seed starters, so they made do with what was sitting right there on the porch or out behind the smokehouse, and somehow, those gardens fed whole families through the winter. Today, we're digging up 27 hillbilly gardening tricks that country grandmas swore by for bigger, better harvests. Grab a mason jar of sweet tea and settle in, because these old mountain secrets still work better than half the stuff on the shelf at the feed store. Coffee can compost starter. Long before anybody talked about composting bins, hillbilly grandma kept an old coffee can by the sink. Every potato peel, eggshell, and coffee ground went straight in that can instead of the trash. When it filled up, she'd carry it out and dump it right into a pit behind the garden. This little habit meant nothing ever went to waste, and by spring, that pit had turned into dark, crumbly soil, richer than anything you could buy in a bag. The can was small enough to keep on the counter without stinking up the kitchen, but it added up to wheelbarrows full of free fertilizer over a season. It's proof that good gardening doesn't start in the dirt, it starts in the kitchen. Feed sack mulch. Nothing went to waste on a hillbilly homestead. Not even the burlap sacks that livestock feed came in. Once emptied, Grandma would split the sacks open and lay them flat between the rows of corn and beans. This burlap mulch smothered weeds before they had a chance to take hold, while still letting rain soak through to the roots. As the sacks slowly broke down over the season, they added a layer of organic matter back into the soil. It was a way of getting double duty out of something most folks would have burned or thrown in the ditch, and it kept Grandma from spending her afternoons on her knees pulling weeds in the hot sun. Ash bucket path minding. Hillbilly homes ran on wood heat all winter, which meant there was always a bucket of ash sitting by the stove. Come spring, Grandma didn't throw that ash out. She sprinkled a thin line of it along the garden paths and around the base of cabbage and squash plants. The dry, gritty texture kept slugs and soft-bodied bugs from crossing over, while the potassium in the ash gave root crops like turnips and beets a real boost. She always used a light hand though, since too much ash could tip the soil too far toward alkaline and stunt tender seedlings. It was a simple way to turn the winter's leftovers into the next season's protection. Mason jar cloches. Late frosts could wipe out a whole bed of young tomato plants overnight, and Grandma wasn't about to let that happen after weeks of careful tending. She'd take old mason jars, set them upside down right over each seedling, and press the rim gently into the soil. The glass trapped the sun's warmth during the day and held it through the cold night air, acting like a tiny greenhouse for each individual plant. Come morning, once the frost danger passed and the sun climbed higher, she'd lift the jars off so the plants didn't cook in the heat. This trick let her get tomatoes and peppers into the ground weeks earlier than the neighbors, without spending a dime on plastic row covers. Chicken coop soil boost. There wasn't a hillbilly garden worth its salt that didn't sit close to the chicken coop, and that was no accident. Grandma would rake out the old bedding straw mixed with chicken droppings and let it sit in a pile for a few weeks before working it into the garden beds. Fresh manure could burn tender roots, but aged just right, it turned into one of the richest fertilizers around, packed with nitrogen that leafy greens and corn craved. She always planted her heaviest feeders, like corn and squash, in the beds that got this treatment first. It was a closed loop long before anybody called it sustainable farming. The chickens fed the garden, and the garden scraps fed the chickens right back. Sassafras root pest chase. Deep in the hills, sassafras trees grew wild along the fence lines, and Grandma knew their roots held more than just tea-making power. She'd dig up a few small roots, crush them, and scatter the pieces around plants that flea beetles and cabbage worms liked to target. The strong, sweet, spicy smell confused the pests searching for their favorite meal, sending them off toward less protected patches instead. It wasn't a cure-all, but paired with her other tricks, it gave the cabbage and collards just enough of an edge to grow past the seedling stage without getting chewed to lace. Free, wild, and already growing along every mountain road, sassafras was one of Grandma's quiet secret weapons. Buttermilk fungus fighter. When the humidity rolled thick through the holler in late summer, powdery mildew loved to creep across squash and cucumber leaves. Grandma's answer sat right in the icebox. She'd mix a bit of soured buttermilk with water and spray it lightly over the affected leaves in the cool of the evening. The mild acidity and beneficial bacteria in the buttermilk worked together to slow the spread of the fungus without harming the plant. It wasn't an overnight fix, but with regular use every few days, the leaves would gradually clear up and stay greener longer into the season. This trick turned a fridge staple into one of the gentlest fungicides a garden could ask for. Corn husk seed starters. Instead of buying little plastic trays for starting seeds indoors, Grandma saved every corn husk from summer canning and let them dry through the winter. Come spring, she'd fold the husks into small cup shapes, tie them loosely with string, fill them with starter soil, and drop the seeds in. When it was time to transplant, the whole husk went straight into the ground, roots undisturbed and stress-free. The husk itself broke down naturally in the soil within a few weeks, feeding the young plant even more as it decomposed. It cost nothing but saved corn husks and a little patience, proving once again that Grandma never really threw anything away if there was a use left in it. Sock scarecrow bird trick. Birds pecking at just planted corn seeds could wipe out a whole row before it even had a chance to sprout. Grandma's fix was as simple as an old sock. She'd stuff a few worn-out socks with rags, tie them onto stakes around the corn patch, and let them flap loosely in the breeze. The unpredictable movement, paired with the strange shapes, kept crows and blackbirds nervous enough to steer clear of the freshly planted rows. Once the corn sprouted a few inches tall and wasn't worth pecking at anymore, she'd pull the socks down and use them again next season. It cost nothing, worked better than most store-bought bird tape, and gave the corn just enough of a head start to establish strong roots. Lard can potato tower. Just like the tire trick some folks used down in the flatlands, Hillbilly Grandma had her own version using old lard cans with the bottoms cut out. She'd stack a can on the ground, fill it partway with soil, and plant her seed potatoes inside. As the green shoots pushed up and out of the soil, she'd set another bottomless can on top and mound in more dirt, burying the stems further. This encouraged the plant to keep forming new potatoes all along the buried stem instead of just at the base. By the time 3 or 4 cans were stacked high, that little tower held pounds of potatoes in a space no bigger than a wash basin, and harvesting meant simply lifting the cans away instead of digging through half the yard. Vinegar jug weed killer. Gravel paths and the cracks along the porch steps always seemed to sprout weeds no matter how many times Grandma pulled them. Instead of reaching for anything from a store shelf, she kept an old vinegar jug handy and poured it straight onto the stubborn patches on a hot sunny afternoon. The acidity dried out the leaves fast, and combined with the heat of direct sun, the weeds would wither within a day or two. It worked best on young, shallow-rooted weeds rather than deep-rooted perennial ones, so she'd repeat the treatment as needed. It kept the walking paths tidy without ever risking the vegetable beds a few feet away. Old quilt frost blanket. When an unexpected cold snap threatened to hit after the garden was already thriving, Grandma didn't panic. She reached for the quilts too worn and thin to use on the beds anymore and draped them right over the rows of beans, squash, and tomatoes. The heavy cotton batting trapped the day's warmth close to the plants and kept the frost from settling directly onto the leaves overnight. Come morning, once the sun climbed high enough to melt any frost on the ground, she'd pull the quilts back off to let the plants breathe and soak up light again. It was a way of putting old, worn-out linens to one last useful job before they finally fell apart for good. Molasses soil sweetener. A little jar of blackstrap molasses did more in Grandma's garden than sweeten a batch of cookies. She'd mix a spoonful into a gallon of water and pour it slowly around the base of her tomato and pepper plants once every few weeks. The natural sugars in the molasses fed the beneficial microbes living in the soil, helping them multiply and break down nutrients the plants could actually use. It also carried a bit of potassium and iron, both of which helped fruit develop fuller and richer in flavor. This trick turned a pantry staple most families already had on hand into a slow, steady feeding system that kept the soil alive and working all season long. Tobacco stem pest spray. In tobacco country, the discarded stems and leaves left behind after harvest weren't wasted. Grandma would soak a handful of tobacco stems in a bucket of water overnight, then strain the liquid and use it as a spray on plants troubled by aphids and soft-bodied pests. The nicotine naturally present in the tobacco acted as a strong deterrent, driving pests away from tender new growth. She always used this one sparingly and kept it away from anything close to harvest, since it was strong enough to need careful handling. Used wisely on ornamentals or early-season crops, it gave the garden a fighting chance against pests without spending a cent on chemical sprays from town. Creek gravel drainage trick. Clay-heavy mountain soil could hold water so tight that plant roots would drown before they ever got established. Grandma's solution was to haul a bit of creek gravel up from the water's edge and work it into the bottom of her planting holes, especially for anything prone to root rot like peppers and melons. The gravel created small air pockets that let excess water drain away instead of pooling around fragile roots. It also helped warm the soil faster in spring, since gravel held onto heat better than solid clay. This trick took a little extra labor up front, but it meant healthier roots and far fewer losses when the mountain rains came down hard and steady. Wood stove ash lye soap spray. Before store-bought insecticidal soap ever hit the shelves, Grandma made her own version using ash from the wood stove. She'd steep a cup of ash in hot water overnight to create a mild lye solution, strain it carefully, and mix in a touch of leftover soap shavings. Sprayed onto the undersides of leaves, this mixture coated soft-bodied pests like aphids and disrupted their protective waxy layer, drying them out over a day or two. It took a delicate hand to get the concentration right, since too strong a mix could scorch the leaves themselves. Done properly, though, it worked as well as anything you could buy, using nothing but what was already sitting in the stove. Sawdust pathway trick. Sawmills dotted the hills, and Grandma never let good sawdust go to waste. She'd haul bags of it home and lay a thick layer down along the walking paths between her garden rows. This kept boots from tracking mud straight through the beds after a rainstorm and gave the whole garden a tidy, walkable look all season. As the sawdust slowly broke down over a year or two, she'd rake it into the beds themselves, where it added organic matter and helped loosen compacted soil. It was a simple trick that solved a muddy mess and fed the ground at the same time, using material that most folks around the sawmill were happy to give away for free. Sourwood honey seed soak. Beekeeping ran in most hillbilly families, and Grandma found more than one use for the honey her hives produced. Before sowing stubborn seeds like okra or squash, she'd dissolve a spoonful of raw sourwood honey into warm water and let the seeds soak for several hours. The natural enzymes and antibacterial properties in raw honey helped protect the seed from rot while it softened the tough outer coating, encouraging faster, more even germination. It was a trick passed down through generations of mountain beekeepers who understood that honey wasn't just for the table. Used right, it gave stubborn seeds the gentle push they needed to sprout strong and steady. Cedar shaving pest barrier. Cedar trees grew thick across the ridges, and their fragrant shavings did more than just line a hope chest. Grandma would collect cedar shavings from wood scraps and scatter them around the base of her bean and cabbage plants. The strong natural oils in the cedar repelled a wide range of crawling insects, including ants and certain beetles, without harming the plants themselves. As an added bonus, the shavings helped the soil hold moisture a bit longer during dry spells while slowly breaking down and enriching the ground. It was a fragrant, effective barrier built entirely from scraps that most folks would have simply burned in the stove. Buried jar composting. Not every scrap needed a full compost pile to break down properly. For smaller amounts of kitchen waste, Grandma used an old trick called trench or jar composting. She'd dig a hole right in an empty spot of the garden bed, drop in vegetable scraps, and cover them back over with soil immediately. This kept the smell down and pests away while the scraps decomposed directly where the nutrients were needed most. A few weeks later, that exact spot would be ready for planting, enriched from the inside out. It was a low-effort, no-fuss way of feeding the soil without hauling materials back and forth to a separate compost pile. Widiowar, sock puppet pollinator lure. When squash blossoms weren't getting pollinated fast enough on their own, Grandma had a hands-on trick to help things along. She'd take an old cotton sock, turn it inside out over her hand like a puppet, and gently brush it across the inside of each male and female blossom to transfer pollen by hand. This simple bit of manual pollination made sure that even on days when bee activity was low, the squash and cucumber vines still set fruit reliably. It took a little extra time each morning while the blossoms were freshly open, but it meant a garden that produced steadily, instead of gambling entirely on the bees showing up when needed. Willow water rooting boost. Long before rooting hormone powder existed on any store shelf, mountain gardeners knew that willow branches held a natural secret. Grandma would cut young willow twigs, chop them into small pieces, and soak them in a bucket of water for a day or two. This created a mild solution rich in natural rooting compounds that willow trees produce to heal and regrow quickly. She'd use this willow water to soak cuttings from tomatoes, roses, or other plants she wanted to propagate, giving them a real head start on developing strong new roots. It cost nothing but a short walk to the creek bank where willows always grew thick and free. Flour dusting for cabbage worms. Cabbage worms could strip a head of cabbage down to lace in just a few days if left unchecked. Grandma's trick was as simple as reaching into the flour bin. She'd lightly dust the leaves with plain flour on a dewy morning, when the moisture helped it stick. As the worms crawled across the coated leaves and tried to eat, the flour dried out and disrupted their digestion, discouraging them from sticking around. It was gentle enough not to harm the plant and required no special mixing or straining, just a light hand and a flour sifter she already kept in the kitchen for baking. Rusty nail tomato boost. Tomatoes craved calcium and iron to grow strong and avoid problems like blossom end rot, and Grandma had an old trick using something most folks would have thrown in the scrap pile. She'd drop a few clean rusty nails into the planting hole before setting each tomato start into the ground. As the nails slowly oxidized further in the moist soil, they released small amounts of iron that the plant's roots could draw on over the season. It wasn't a fast fix, but as a slow, steady mineral boost buried right where the roots would eventually reach, it gave tomato plants one more advantage without costing a single penny. Straw bale gardening. When the soil on a hillside plot was too rocky or too poor to work easily, Grandma didn't waste time fighting it. She'd line up straw bales, soak them daily with water for about a week to kickstart the decomposition process inside, then plant seedlings directly into pockets cut in the top of each bale. As the straw broke down over the season, it released a steady supply of nutrients while staying loose and easy for roots to spread through. This method also lifted the growing bed up off the ground, which meant better drainage and fewer problems with pests crawling up from the soil below. By the end of the season, the spent bales themselves would crumble into rich compost ready for next year. Mothball-free cedar block critter chase. Groundhogs and rabbits could undo weeks of hard work in a single night, but Grandma refused to use anything toxic near her food. Instead, she'd tuck small blocks of cedar wood around the garden's edges, especially near known burrow entrances. The strong cedar scent bothered the sensitive noses of these critters enough to send them looking for an easier meal elsewhere. She'd refresh the blocks every few weeks as the scent faded, sanding down the surface slightly to release fresh oils. It wasn't foolproof against a truly determined rabbit, but paired with a simple fence of chicken wire, it kept the worst of the damage away without a single harmful chemical. Sun tea fertilizer. Grandma brewed more than just sweet tea in a mason jar on the porch rail. She'd fill a jar with fresh grass clippings, comfrey leaves if she had them growing, and water, then set it in the sun for several days to steep. The resulting dark, pungent liquid was strained and diluted before being poured around the base of heavy-feeding plants like squash and corn. This homemade tea delivered a quick dose of nitrogen and other nutrients straight to the roots, giving tired-looking plants a fast greening boost in the middle of the season. The smell was strong enough to keep it far from the porch once it was ready, but the results in the garden made the odor entirely worth it. Moon phase harvesting for storage crops. Just like planting by the moon, Hillbilly Grandma believed the timing of the harvest mattered every bit as much as the timing of the planting. Root vegetables meant for winter storage, like potatoes and turnips, were dug during the waning moon, when she believed the plant's energy had pulled back down into the roots, making them denser and better suited for keeping through the cold months. Above-ground crops meant for immediate eating, on the other hand, were picked during a waxing moon, when she felt they were at their peak flavor and moisture. Whether it was old folklore or simply a habit of paying closer attention to the growing cycle, this rhythm kept her root cellar stocked well past the first thaw of spring. Whittled peg row markers. With a good pocket knife always close at hand, Grandma never needed to buy plastic plant markers from the store. She'd whittle small wooden pegs from scrap wood, carve or burn the name of each crop into the flat side, and push them into the ground at the start of every row. These simple markers held up through rain and sun far better than paper tags ever could, and carving each one became a quiet evening task done by the fire before the next planting season began. It was one more small reminder that on a hillbilly homestead, nothing needed to be bought new when a little patience and a sharp blade could make something just as good and built to last a whole lot longer. And there you have it, 27 hillbilly gardening tricks that country grandmas swore by, passed down through generations without ever needing a single trip to the store. From coffee cans on the counter to rusty nails in the tomato hole, every single one of these tricks came from paying close attention, wasting nothing, and trusting the wisdom that got handed down around the supper table. If your own grandma had a trick that didn't make this list, drop it in the comments so it doesn't get lost to time. And if these old mountain secrets brought back a memory or two, give this video a like and share it with someone who still remembers what a real garden used to look like.